Hey, good afternoon, church. I hope this Wednesday you're doing well and you're healthy and things are going well for you. And if you were able to be with us last Sunday, we're glad that you're here. And we know that some of you, it's just not time to go, and we certainly respect that and honor your decision. And just stay tuned for things that are going on around us. I know that we've had a spike in COVID, and so we are certainly aware of that and in conversation about the impact of that. So watch for email updates in the blast and look for information from our elders about our assemblies and what we're going to do on Wednesdays going forward. And so anyway, we're glad that you're joining this afternoon as we continue to look at and study really, to me, one of the most uplifting and encouraging books in the Old Testament, and that is the book of Ruth. And so last week, you may remember if you were with us that Naomi, who is one of the main characters of the book, whose name means pleasant, as she came back from Moab after losing her husband and her two sons in death, comes back to Bethlehem with her daughter-in-law Ruth, and decides that God has dealt harshly with her, and to reflect that feeling, she changes her name from Naomi, which means pleasant, to Mara, which means bitter, because of how life had turned out. So life didn't turn out the way she expected, and now she is dealing with the impact of a life that's going to be difficult. She is a female in a very male-dominated society. She doesn't have a lot of rights and a lot of power. And plus, she has this Moabite daughter-in-law who she's also got to take care of. So life's pressed in pretty hard on Naomi. But she does have an unconditional love from Ruth, which I believe offers her some hope. And she does have an awareness that God is real and that God is active still in the land of Bethlehem, as the famine which was once there is now over, and now they're back in place. And so in chapter 2, we're introduced to another major character in the book of Ruth, and that is Boaz. And as the story develops, I'll say more about Boaz's character, and especially when we get to chapter 4 and what Boaz does in practice. But I think what Boaz does theologically in acting the way that he acts. And then we'll connect all the dots when we finish up about Boaz and how Boaz and Ruth have fit into our story, because they certainly have. Let's go ahead and read the first few verses of chapter 2. Probably read down through about verse 16 of chapter 2. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain, behind someone in whose sight I might find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. And as it happened, she came to a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." And Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting even for a moment. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field, or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eye on the field that is being reaped, and follow behind them. I have ordered the young man not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wing you have come for refuge." Then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in this sour wine." So she sat behind the reapers and heaped up for her some parched grain. She ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. When she got up to glean, Boaz instructed his young men, "Let her glean even among the standing sheaves, and do not reproach her. You must also pull out some handfuls for her from the bundles, and leave them for her to glean, and do not rebuke her." Wow, there's so much packed into those 16 verses. You know, I'm reminded of a Latin proverb that says, "Providence assists not the idle." What I find amazing about Ruth, remember in chapter 1, is she pledged her loyalty to Naomi, and now she wants to act on that. In other words, she wants to embody the commitment that she made to her mother-in-law, and apparently she understood some of the laws and customs of the land. I would certainly attribute that to Naomi and Elimelech for perhaps teaching her those things. And she understood about gleaning, and I'll get to that in just a minute. But she wanted to help. And so I think one thing we learned from Ruth in the first part of chapter 2 is this, is it's one thing to have an espoused faith or an espoused belief in Jesus. It's another thing to embody that faith that we've espoused. And Ruth certainly does that as she pledged her loyalty to Naomi. She asked the question, kind of behind the question, is what can I do to help? And recognizing that it was harvest time, and there they were now most likely not having anything to harvest. They're going to count on the goodness and the grace of others in the community to take care of them. And I think sometimes, church, we also have to realize that it's okay to ask for help. I know that we live in this world, and we've been trained and been accustomed to look out for ourselves and to take care of ourselves and to manage our own business. But, you know, sometimes life just gets too tough for us to try to manage by ourselves. And it's really good for us to be humble enough to say, I need help. And I believe that Ruth recognizes that for her and Naomi. And so she asks. And so she's courageous. This is faith that is lived out in a very courageous way. Remember, she is a foreign woman, and I would say a very attractive foreign woman based on what Boaz said about to his young man to leave her alone, who's now subjecting herself to a culture that she knows very little about, that she could very well be unaccepted. She's poor, she's female, she has no rights, she's really in the lower rungs of society as far as the pecking order goes in Israel. And so she's courageous enough and loves her mother-in-law enough that, you know what, I'm willing to mitigate and take the risk to do the right thing. And sometimes, church, that's where we end up as we think about life, and we struggle sometime with, you know, how to act and when to act. There's never a wrong time to do the right thing. And so I mentioned in our sermon last Sunday when we talked about the times that God says do not fear, that the antithesis of fear is not really courage, it's faith. It's trusting in God and trusting that doing the right thing will find its own reward. And so she goes to the field. I think she doesn't go blindly, though. She goes with some understanding of the law of Moses and what Torah had to say. For example, in Deuteronomy 10, there is a passage in verse 18 where God is described as one who administers justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the stranger by giving them food. And so if God does that, certainly that means that we embody what God does. On numerous occasions, God's pointed out that his people were to care for the poor and the widow. Leviticus 19 says that we are to love the stranger and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We also find in Leviticus 19 the gleaning laws. That is, if you had a field And during the harvest time, around the edges of the field, you were to leave grain and food and produce for the poorest in the community to go out and to pick up what they could so they could survive. And that was part of being faithful to God. I think it's just a reminder, and Boaz reminds us as he interacts with Ruth and honors the gleaning laws of Leviticus 19, that you know what? It's really all God's real estate, and we are here to be stewards of it. And it's these things that we possess, our possessions, our properties, our land, our money, are here to honor God. And they make us comfortable, and they feed us, and they take care of our business, but we're also to use those things in honor of God to take care of others. And Boaz certainly does that. And so I believe that Ruth understands the gleaning laws and understands the law of Torah, and she trusts Naomi, and she trusts her judgment, and she trusts Boaz, who's now who is part of the family of Naomi through Elimelech, that they're going to honor those laws as well. And man, wouldn't that be great if we are known as a church who can be trusted to honor God in all that we do? And so not only does Ruth have this courageous faith and an informed faith, she also has a faith that's active, and she goes out and works in the field. And what she does, and she impressed the workers. And they even mention when Boaz comes in, probably right before lunch, that Ruth's been at it all day long, gleaning and taking care of gathering enough food to take care of her and her mother-in-law. And so she doesn't go to the field and just, take advantage of her beauty and bat her eyes a bit and say, hey, boys, take care of me. What Ruth does is she goes out and honors the law by doing the gleaning, just as the law would say. And then she does that again, I think, in honor of her mother-in-law to take care of her. And so then as she meets Boaz, and Boaz is such a fascinating character in this book. So he's a near kindred, one when we get to the Levirate marriage law later in the book, we talked about a little bit later, one who would be in the lineage of Elimelech, and he understands his responsibility as a property owner, but he also understands his responsibility to Naomi and now to Ruth as a family member of Elimelech. And so he acts graciously. And Ruth was looking for someone to be gracious unto her. And that is to show her favor that wasn't merited or maybe not even understood. And especially in her situation as a foreign widow, she really did have to count on the graciousness of others. And so as she happens upon the field of Boaz, this relative of Naomi, Boaz begins to inquire about her and then shows her favor. And then really shows us somewhat how we act graciously and how grace works. Because the giver of grace, in this case Boaz, initiates the action. Go to my field, stay in my field. I've told my young men to leave you alone. Share in my water, eat my food. The receiver of grace then doesn't put, it's not put in this position of indebtedness. Well, I'll do this for you, you do this for me, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. The giver of grace then offers this thing freely, and then the receiver accepts it humbly and with thanksgiving and acts upon the condition. And so as Boaz interacts with Ruth, it's interesting, not only does he give her the minimum, right, that he could, that is, to be a strict constructionist of the law, to leave a little bit on the edge of the field. What Boaz does in this great act of graciousness is say, you know what, not only do you need not go anywhere else, you just stay here in my field. He instructs that his workers to make sure that she gets part of the good stuff, the original crop, the first fruits, if you will, of the harvest, and not just on the edges, but to give her extra portions. And the more I think about how God acts in us and what a great shadow and type Boaz is of God in this realm of graciousness, that God not only gives us what we need, God gives us abundance. He supplies with us our every need. Paul said that God will give us more than we can even think to ask. So Ruth goes out hoping to get enough grain to make a sandwich. She goes home with enough to be sustained for a while. She's full. And I think one of the verses that I really think is significant in chapter 2 is that she ate until she was satisfied and she had some left over. And that's really the grace of God, isn't it? A satisfying grace where there's always an abundance left over. God never stops giving. God never stops being faithful. God never stops being gracious toward us. And Boaz gives us a great example of how to live graciously as well as faithfully. Listen, Boaz has taken money out of his own pocket by giving grain and food away. But he's also, I think there's a bigger picture and a bigger situation at work here, is I believe that Boaz is beginning to connect the dots of what God's doing in his little world and in his context. And I think that's something, church, that we need to be aware of, is where is God active in our fields, so to speak? Where is God active amongst what we're doing in our area of influence? And can we see God at work? And when we see God at work, will we join God at work? So God's at work in the life of Ruth and Naomi, and Boaz recognizes that. And to his credit, he says, I want to be a part of this. And I want to join God in being gracious to this woman who's been gracious to her mother-in-law in a time of trial and hardship and difficulty. He really does express the grace and love of God through his actions towards Ruth. So we'll pick up in verse 17 next week as we consider the rest of this story. Again, it is one of the most encouraging and heartwarming accounts that we have in the Old Testament of just how God works and who God is and how God is so involved in our day-to-day life if we would only wake up and be aware of his involvement. I love you. Grace and peace to you. I hope you have a blessed rest of the day, and I hope that you're able to come worship with us on Sunday. God bless.